Austin said you said that the Didache was says that you're not allowed to eat food offered to idols, no matter what. You said that Paul in 1 Corinthians 8 says you're allowed to eat food offered to idols. I don't see that. How could Paul be saying that if the Torah specifically tells us not to eat food offered to idols? And I wrote back and I said, this is a great question. We'll talk about it. But can you please tell me where the Torah tells us not to eat food offered to idols? We've talked about this on this show before, but sometimes it's good to review these things, okay? So Austin wrote back. I'm going to read his response now. This is what he says. He says, according to the Orthodox Union, it is found in Exodus 34. Now, I'm not exactly sure why the Orthodox Union would be, they also say that Yeshua is not the Messiah. So, I'm skeptical to take their biblical interpretation on just about anything, but not the point. Let's keep going. He says, he quotes Exodus 34:15. You should not forge a treaty with the locals, then stray after their gods, slaughter to those idols, and be invited by them to eat from such offerings. And Deuteronomy 32, he says, and then
if you continue that verse, it talks about fornication, basically it leading to sexual sin.
Yes.
Which Paul also addresses in 1 Corinthians.
Yes, you're right. Absolutely. He says also Deuteronomy 32, the fat of whose offerings they ate, they drank the wine of whose libations. This is Deuteronomy 32:20. Sorry, I cannot talk right now. Deuteronomy 32:38. Then Austin goes on. This is now Austin's own words. He says their website then elaborates with the rabbinic texts that address the issue. And he quotes this mitzvah is discussed. Well, I'll read from this. He says this view seems to be held in common with the Apostolic Council decree of Acts 15.
Right.
I agree with that. Okay, so let's now go to. He gives us the Austin was kind enough to cite his reference. Let's go to that reference. This is Commandment 111. Disinvited the prohibition against eating food or drinking wine offered to idols. This is in your show notes for those of you who received the show notes. By the way, if you'd like to receive our show notes, just go to TorahResource.com. Under the radio tab on the toolbar, just hover over that, go down to the Rob and Caleb Show page. Once you get there, there's a sign-up form that you can just name an email address. That's all you need to put in, and you'll get our show notes every week. Okay? So this article by the Orthodox Union was written by Rabbi Jack Abramowitz. He says, first he quotes Exodus 34:15, which we just quoted, and then he says, the Torah cautions us, this is not long, by the way, I'm probably going to read this whole article. The Torah cautions us in several places not to forge treaties with the idolatrous inhabitants of Canaan. One such warning is in verse 34:12. Here it gives a reason for this ban. If we get complacent with them, we'll end up eating from their sacrifices, which we are not to do. I disagree with this. I don't think that that's exactly what it says. I think he's stretching now a little. Anyway, he goes on. We've already seen in Mitzvah 26 that idolatry is prohibited. That's obvious. That's a serious sin. Nothing could be a bigger metaphoric slap in the face to God than serving a false god. This is one more way in which we are warned off from getting anywhere near that trap. Accordingly, anything used in the worship of an idol, even something seemingly insignificant like water or salt, is prohibited for us. Where does he get that? That's obviously rabbinic tradition. This mitzvah is elaborated upon in Parshas Ha'azinu. Speaking of idols, the Torah says, the fat of whose offerings they ate, they drank the wine of whose libations. We see that the Torah equates the meat of idolatrous offerings and the wine of idolatrous libations in this regard. He's going to go on. I won't read the last two paragraphs, but basically this is his argument. I don't see that. I don't see it. In Exodus 34:15, this whole thing is tied together. You shall not forge a treaty with the locals, then stray after their idols, slaughter to those idols, and be invited by them to eat from such offerings. In other words, you're not allowed to participate, and this is Paul's point in 1 Corinthians 10. You're not allowed to participate in the meal offerings to a false god. In other words, you can't go and have a meal to Tammuz. You can't go and have a dedication meal to Saturn. You can't make an offering, slaughter an animal, put it on the fire, and do this all as an act to a false god, and then eat the meat.
First of all, 1 Corinthians, you have to realize he's quoting a lot of slogans,
Yeah.
the Corinthian slogans that he's interacting with. So that's
A fascinating study, by the way.
yeah.
Corinthian
So-
studies,
but in
Corinthian
any
slogans.
event,
Yeah.
so he's taking sayings that are current in their world, and he is interacting with them to try to steer him. Here's the way you need to read this. You need to read this: that Paul is putting the Torah of the Messiah at the forefront. He says the Shema and love your neighbor are the core. Why the Shema? The Shema because he's saying there's no God, there's only one God. That these things called idols are really not gods. And there are some people that understand that. But they're taking that and they're forgetting to love your neighbor. And they're going and believing through kind of a Stoic philosophy that even Philo of Alexandria had, was that this privileged knowledge or wisdom makes a person autonomous in their ability they have authority and freedom. And the people who took that to an extreme was that this wisdom they had basically was in their soul but not in their body. So there were people who could do whatever they wanted with their body,
Yeah.
but their soul would remain with God. And Paul is absolutely against that, and he's against it. And he talks about it in terms of the sexual sin, particularly. He said it's not that the Spirit of God dwells with your soul, but in your body. And this has to do with the incarnation of the Word of God becoming flesh, and a lot of important stuff behind the scenes here. But what Paul wants to do is to get these Corinthians who are floating around thinking that they have this freedom to do whatever they want, to get them back into their bodies by having to love their neighbor as themselves, to bring this other picture in there. And so Paul's trying to meet them on the terms where they're coming from philosophically, but undermining them and getting them back to orient their life according to the greatest two commandments, as Yeshua taught. Okay, that's one thing. The other key distinction, and Caleb, you already touched on it, is that Paul's making is meat sold in a marketplace versus cultic meals.
Okay, yeah. Let's actually
Meat sold in marketplace. Paul says, you can go ahead and eat meat sold in the marketplace.
I have two analogies here,
But then so what it seems to be is that Paul's making what we would call halakhic distinction between if meat is out in the marketplace for sale, it is by definition, it seems that Paul would say, it is not part of a cultic sacrifice. In other words, the cultic sacrifice is what he unpacks in 1 Corinthians 10, where there's sexual sin, there's idolatry, and then there's the eating of meat sacrificed unto demons. He says it's demonic.
Yeah.
And you can't do that and be a believer in Yeshua. So Paul's pointing out there's a ritual social activity where sacrificed meat is partaken that Paul would say is forbidden. And then there's just the marketplace, which Paul seems to, in my understanding, take as it's neutral of any of that. But then if someone comes along and then tells you, oh, well, hey, that was offered to sacrifices, or that was offered to a divinity, then he says don't eat it.
But why does he say don't eat it? It's for their sake.
He says don't eat it because of the conscience of
That person.
who's
Confronting
labeling
him.
it.
Yeah. So let's read 1 Corinthians 10:25 real quick. He says, "Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any questions on the grounds of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any questions on the grounds of conscience." People try to use this to say that we can eat unkosher food. No. He's talking about things that might be offered to idols. I have a perfect analogy for this. Somebody asked me recently. I live the office that I work at is in the north end of Tacoma, and there's a little grocery store right down from where the office is. and it's a gas station / grocery store. You walk into the front doors, and there's a huge Buddha sitting right there. Okay, and they always have, like their incense, their incense going in their little fruit and whatnot in his jar and whatnot. So somebody asked me recently, are we allowed to go in there and buy the food from that grocery store, from that little market? Because we know that the person who owns that store says blessings and prayers over their store all the time and gives it into the hands of what we can assume is a demon, right? So isn't that food offered to idols? I think this is exactly what Paul is talking about here in 1 Corinthians 10, is that they would say, in the Roman markets, they would say incantations over all that food. Was it offered to idols? In a way it was. And so he's saying, it doesn't matter. That doesn't matter.